Okay, well, welcome everyone. If you're just tuning in now, you might think that you were showing up late and had missed already an hour of the presentation or something, because we were already deep into discussing inequalities of aging and support for elder care workers. But in fact, that was just the warm up. I think there's so much to talk about with this idea. We were overflowing and already getting into a rich discussion. So we have a very exciting event today. Thanks for everyone for coming. Thank you, Professor Buch and Professor Ward, for agreeing to present today and to comment today. Real quick, I just want to give you all a heads up on upcoming events. So let me share the screen real quick. Can you all see that? These three upcoming events on Friday, November 19th at noon Central Time, US. Maurice Hamilton and some of his co-authors will be presenting on their book, Care Ethics in the Age of Precarity. January 28th, Carol Gilligan, I'm going to be talking to her next week, I think, but she'll be talking, she's going to present on something, care ethics related. And on March 4th, Sarah Munawar is going to be presenting, and she has a couple of things that a couple ideas about maybe I think she said she might do an Islamic concept of dulia, or the right to exit abusive relationships within under Islam, something like that. So anyway, we have three great events coming up. Mark your calendars. You can already register for the November 19th and January 28th events if you would like, and I'll send out a link for the Sarah Munawar talk pretty soon. So let me stop that share. I didn't introduce myself. Most of you probably know me from earlier events, but my name's Dan Inkster. I'm a professor at the University of Houston. I'm the director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership, which is the sponsor of these events. We're going to try to continue this through the rest of this year. Like I said, there are several good events coming up, and I hope to add maybe one more later in the semester. Today, Elana Buch will be presenting her book, Inequalities of Aging, Paradoxes of Independence in American Home Care, which came out from NYU Press in 2018. Professor Buch is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Iowa, which I think is interesting. I don't think we've had anyone from anthropology present yet. So this is great to get a little bit more interdisciplinary with these care ethics presentations. She's interested in sociocultural, medical, and applied anthropology, and notably has a Master of Social Work and a PhD from University of Michigan's Joint Program in Social Work and Social Science. So she comes at this both academically, but also from a little bit of a more hands-on perspective. Commenting on today's paper is Professor Lizzie Ward, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Brighton. Professor Ward has written extensively on care ethics and aging, including some recent work on fairness between generations in times of COVID-19. So we might talk about that a little bit today. She also works on social care, self-care, intergenerational relationships, adult social care, practice and participation. And she also worked for many years in the voluntary and community sector. So she also has this hands-on approach to issues of care and generative labor, which she brings to her work. Our format today is, as usual, Professor Buch will talk about her book for 15 minutes or so. No exact time. Professor Ward will then offer 15 minutes or so of commentary. Then we'll open the floor for questions or commentary, or kind of free-flowing discussion if that's what you'd like. If you have a question, please just use the chat function, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just click on it and just type question. That's all you have to do, and send it to me, and it'll show up, and I'll have you in order, and I'll just go down the order and ask you to ask your question or make your comment in order. So again, let me thank Professor Buch and Professor Ward for agreeing to present today. And with that, let me hand things over to Professor Buch.
Hi all. I'm so delighted to be here and to speak with you about my work and to have a conversation about the work. I've only recently joined the group and I found it such a warm and invigorating space to discuss questions of care. So I'm really grateful to be able to do that. And the questions and discussions have been somewhat different from the ones I'm used to in anthropology. So it's a special pleasure to engage in questions in a different way. I want to especially thank Dr. Engster for organizing the conversation in our series and for Professor Ward for taking the time to comment on my work. And I also want to thank my colleague Asha Bandari here at the University of Iowa, who included me and introduced me to the group. So my book is based on ethnographic fieldwork that was done now more than a decade ago. At that time, I spent 2 years in Chicago involved in the daily work and lives of home care workers, older adults, and the agency staff who trained and managed them. And supervise those relationships. My research was based with 2 home care agencies, one that was publicly funded and one that was privately funded. Given the racial and economic geographies of Chicago, this meant that the clients of the privately funded agency were primarily white, and the home care workers are primarily Black, Latina, and Filipino women. The clients and workers of the publicly funded agency were both predominantly Black. I'm happy to talk more about the research or the people I worked with or the demographics of the agencies if you have questions about those. So while much has changed in the world and in home care since then, and especially in the past couple of years, my context suggests that much of what have written remains current in terms of the interpersonal relationships in care, the managerial practices and the structures of home care agencies. Of course, the broader social, racial, and economic dynamics shaping home care and elder care more broadly have only become more stark in pandemic times. So while the full impact of COVID on home care and elder care in the United States is still being assessed, I can share the early information that I'm aware of, much of which suggests that most of the things that I'm talking about, those cracks just expanded. So the book is very much written from an anthropological perspective, but you might notice it betrays my joint training in social work. The social work perspective makes me attentive to the ways that policy affects and is affected by practice in everyday care. And as an anthropologist, my questions about care are informed by a comparative, empirical, and theoretical perspective. So from this lens, morality and ethics are observable aspects of human life and sociality, meaning that as an anthropologist, I'm not primarily interested in what people's morals or ethics should be. Rather, I'm asking questions about what people's morals and ethics are, as we observe them play out both in discourse and in practice. So for example, I'm interested in how people talk about and enact their understandings of the good in social life, and more specifically, the good in care, as well as the consequences of those discourses and enactments. So I focus on empirical questions about how people come to think about good care and what they think care relations should be like, rather than addressing questions about, in the abstract, what good care is or should be in a philosophical way. So engaging with questions about people's lived experience of care is, I hope, helpful to feminist ethicists in the sense that it can provide important context for thinking about the ways that local understandings of moral categories of things like personhood are creating both the stakes and contradictions of care in any particular setting. So building on my fieldwork with home care workers, older adults and agency staff in Chicago, I argue that it's precisely because everyday care is generative of personhood that it is generative of inequality. In particular, I argue that the material, bodily, and affective work of sustaining older adults in ways that they and others consider independent generates and intensifies social inequality. So those two things can't entirely be separated in this context. To make the argument, I build on socialist feminist theories of reproductive labor and anthropological theories of personhood. So when I'm drawing on feminist theorists, drawing on the essential insights of socialist feminist theorists who characterize care as a key form or a way of thinking about reproductive labor. And also to emphasize the importance, I build on those ideas to emphasize the importance of analyzing the ways in which care is generative of broader social phenomenon and not only inherently reproductive of them. And I'll say a little more about that in a minute. I was interested in thinking about ways to discuss care that would widen attention to care across the life course. Of course, the socialist feminists have been talking about social reproduction across the life course for a long time, but in anthropology in particular, studies of reproductive labor and stratified reproduction are the way that reproductive activities reproduce inequality, have most frequently focused on social policies and politics around biological reproduction and the care of babies and young children, and have less frequently thought about other moments in the life course. So I framed care as generative to show how everyday relations and practices of care are key sites for the social generation of things like social inequality, in part because of the ways that daily care shapes people's moral senses of themselves and their relations to others. So in the book, I focus primarily on the ways that people's experience of care across the life course and their bodily engagements with care in the present generate their senses of personhood, morality, and obligations to others. These processes participate in the generation of inequality that is simultaneously embodied and structural. So the second part of my argument is that independence, which is the way that I think about the sort of experiential or colloquial form of liberal personhood dominant in the United States, that independence is itself a relational form of personhood in which hierarchical interdependent relations between people are persistently obscured, often through care practices. So here I'm building on longstanding anthropological comparative engagements with questions about how persons come to be made and unmade socially. So here, person is a category of social recognition and social membership. Based on comparative historical and ethnographic evidence, anthropologists have found that the category of the person, the moral category of the person, is attributed in and through social relations rather than standing prior to them. So the making and unmaking of persons is processual and ongoing rather than a discrete event, such that personhood is as much at stake in middle age and later life as it is in infancy or at birth. So across diverse social and cultural contexts, anthropologists find that people rely on a wide range of ideologies and criteria to understand which kinds of beings count as persons, including non-living beings, non-human beings, and that this designation has profound consequences for who is included and excluded in social life. Moreover, anthropologists find that the practices and processes through which persons are socially made and unmade have considerable implications for the constitution of belonging, responsibility, and obligation. So anthropologists have also found that practices of nurturance and care, what we would consider practices of nurturance and care, are key sites for understanding the making and unmaking of persons. So we can look at the making and unmaking of persons. Care is what we think of as care is often a good place to be examining those processes and therefore understanding how those persons are constituted in any context. So as an anthropologist, I approach the notion of independence or liberal personhood as an empirical one, asking how it is that beings come to be recognized or not as an independent person across the life course. And what I found was that, at least among those involved in home care in Chicago, independent personhood is a form of relational personhood. So it's based in social relations like all other forms of personhood, in which independence is generated by invisibilizing hierarchical social relations. Through care practices, embodied hierarchies between older adults and care workers came to be seen and felt as moral, as indicative of good care. These hierarchies unsurprisingly reflected and intensified the broader forms of social inequality that shaped home care itself. So at the same time, the unquestioned goodness of generating independent personhood for older adults meant that these hierarchies were naturalized and obscured precisely by relying on labor produced within. And so it was precisely by relying on labor produced within these invisible hierarchies that older adults are generated as independent persons. So I should clarify here that my argument is not that the attempts of older adults and disabled people to live in a manner considered independent, that their attempts are specifically responsible for social inequality. Liberal personhood across the life course is constituted by hierarchical and invisibilized interdependencies. The demands of performing independent personhood across the life course undergird and generate many of the forms of hierarchy and inequality endemic in liberal society. Old age and debility simply make fundamental human interdependence that's present across the life course harder to obscure. So people who aren't seen as disabled or older find it easier to obscure the kinds of interdependence that we all rely on in order to make life together. So to give you a sense of the kinds of evidence I use to make these arguments, I'll briefly outline the book chapters here, and then we can move on to a discussion. The first ethnographic chapter of the book draws on life histories of 3 very different older adults, exploring how elders came to understand the idea of independence over their long histories of experience. These interviews enable me to analyze the formation of moral imagination, which is a concept anthropologists use to think about how people envision possibilities for a morally better or worse world than the one we live in, to quote anthropologist Julie Livingston. Examining moral imagination is crucial for understanding the stakes of care for older adults and for understanding how they distinguish good care from bad. Older adults did not imagine independence as requiring them to sustain their lives without assistance from anyone else. Instead, they understood independence as generated through reciprocal relationships in which they contributed equitably to the well-being upon those whom they relied. In chapter 2, I draw on care workers' life histories to show how care for kin generated forms of moral imagination in which care practices are inextricably linked to notions of obligation, reciprocity, and sacrifice. For workers, these lessons become survival skills thanks to long histories of discriminatory social policy that regenerate the racial and gendered contours of poverty and funnel impoverished women of color into domestic and care jobs. Chapter 3 examines how home care agencies transform women's domestic expertise and their moral imaginations into wage labor that can be bought and sold at an hourly rate. I look at the extractive practices through which publicly and privately funded agencies train, staff, and manage workers, and the clients necessary to their enterprise. In making care into work, home care agencies and their supervisors negotiate the contradictory demands of care ideologies, economic pressures, and legal regulations in order to generate both profits and lives. So one of the ways that they do this is by cutting both home care workers, but especially home care workers, imagining them as independent from those households, and imagining both their households and workers and older adults households as separate from one another. The heart of the book is in chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 analyzes embodied care practices at the center of home care work. Care practices involve forms of embodied empathy that blur the boundaries between older adults and home care workers' bodies and their personhood. And according to both workers and older adults, good care transforms seemingly straightforward tasks like cooking, cleaning, or grocery shopping into moral practices that help older adults feel independent, like the persons they have always been. So to accomplish this, workers use their bodies as proxies for the bodies of older adults. They sensorially imagine what it would be like to exist as a person with different generational, racial, economic, and gendered experiences. They consider what it might be like to be a person who loves to sail but cannot do so any longer, or what it might feel like to prefer sugary food but be on a diabetic diet. Care workers strove to use these forms of embodied empathy to shape daily care in ways that enables older adults to experience continuity in their subjectivity, even when doing so aroused disgust, made them feel physically uncomfortable, or put them at risk. So many of the care workers I knew thought that putting their clients' bodily and sensorial preferences ahead of their own was just kind of common sense or good moral practice. I argue that this is precisely how embodied care generates moral hierarchies in which some people's needs and preferences are seen as obviously more important than those of others. In this sense, everyday care practices are the ground upon which moral hierarchies between persons are built, experienced, and justified on a day-to-day basis. Of course, in the context at least of paid home care work, these hierarchies reflect and intensify the broader social inequalities that structure the work itself. So because moral hierarchies are generated in the process of making or sustaining independent persons, I argue that independence and inequality are co-constituted in care. The next chapter makes a similar kind of argument about the home in terms of the care of homes, and argues that taking care of homes is inseparable from care for persons in home care, because in part homes are invested with history and memories, and because they're structured or they're imagined as a sign of older adults' independence. So in tandem with maintaining older adults' bodies, workers learn to maintain their clients' homes to sustain that independence. So flows of people, money, and material goods link workers and elders' homes, but agency policies restrict these flows, often leaving workers struggling to maintain their own homes, pay the bills, and maintain their own senses of aesthetic order at home. And the cut restriction of these reciprocities or these flows also means that older adults aren't able to engage in the kinds of reciprocity that they think help them be independent. So while policies construct elders and workers' households as separate economic and social units, my work shows the importance of the flows and webs that connect them. The last ethnographic chapter of the book asks how it was that by the end of my fieldwork, more than half of the workers I knew best had lost, left, or were considering leaving their jobs. In each case, job loss stemmed from workers' inabilities to sustain both their own households and that of the older adults for whom they cared without blurring the boundaries between them. So across the United States, home care faces perpetual worker shortages and endemically high turnover levels, estimated at something like, I think the last estimate I saw was 80% a year, and maybe higher now because of COVID. So in this chapter, I focus on the ways that agency's inability to recognize the interdependence of older adult workers and both of their families contributes to this startling statistic. I show how prohibited reciprocities between workers and older adults place both workers and home care relationships at risk. And I show how societal obsessions with independence have prevented us from building broader systems in which care could be reciprocated. Instead, people positioned to care by racialized and gendered hierarchies of care generate the independence of others and simultaneously find their own personhoods undermined and erased. So at the start of the pandemic, several students and colleagues asked me what I thought about what was going on. And though the fieldwork upon which this book is based was conducted more than a decade before COVID hit, I think the dynamics it describes are indicative of the dynamics currently described as a care crisis, or that have come to be described as a care crisis. They were already, but in the wake of COVID. COVID has made the inequalities of care and aging more visible. And I think one of the things I think is really interesting is that the sort of counter politics or counter fascisms of the moment are articulating alternative futures under the sign of care. The way in which movements towards more reciprocal communities, more reciprocal policies are happening under the sign of care, which I think is about imagining and working towards communal and state practices that better recognize interdependence instead of the kinds of destructive fictions of independence that I described. Or at least that's sort of my hope about what is coming and what is bubbling up in this moment. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to Dr. Ward's comments and to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Ward?
Thank you, Dan, for inviting me, and thank you, Elana. I really enjoyed reading your book, and I found it very thought-provoking. And I found there were many points of connections with my work about older people's experiences of care in the English social care system. And what I really appreciated was your very careful documentation of people's stories. And and I can imagine, I'm not an ethnographer, but I can imagine the amount of work that involves and the care that you need in order to do that work. But what you get is, what you really show is the sort of depth and complexities of their lives and how they are woven in these larger historical processes, as well as their personal experiences, and how we all live through the legacies of what has gone before us, but often in ways that we can't even grasp or understand. I also really liked, as I was mentioning when we just spoke at the beginning, I really like the combination of all of this with the policy review, as someone who comes from a social policy background. And this approach is very close to my heart and my commitment to trying to engage policymakers with the lived experiences of people who are the subject of the decisions that they make. So I think it's a great book for helping us think about inequalities in how aging is experienced, and shining a light on these through the lens of care. It reveals, I think, a lot about assumptions about aging, and also about these very complex intersections of inequalities. And there were really many threads that I could have picked up on in the book, but the main one that I wanted to pick up on is this word independence. It's in your title, it's a key word. It's a word that has taken a huge significance within the English social policy debates and discourse. So I hope you won't mind I've picked on that. And I think actually what is interesting is the very different meanings associated with the word independence and the nuances attached to it and the ways in which it's mobilized. And I found myself thinking a lot about this and the sort of particular, in your book, the particular cultural, historical and sort of position narratives that the word gives life to. So American independence, this idea of the self-made, pioneering man, conquering frontiers, nature and everything in its way, and it's linked to the American dream and possibly even, I don't know, you can tell me, the more recent mobilization with populist politics around making America great again. But I also found myself thinking about other important meanings of independence for enslaved people, for example, for African Americans, to be literally bodily free from enslavement and the right to live freely. And also for women, for maybe white middle-class educated women in the 60s who were rejecting economic dependence on husbands and generating the women's rights movement and 1970s feminism. And for those women, the concept of independence was very important. Fighting for independence from patriarchal systems was a cornerstone of liberal and radical feminisms. So it made me think really about the uses and misuses of independence, or the different ways it can be used. And what really comes across in your book is how old age and aging belies the myth of independence. It's there all along, but it becomes much more obvious in old age. And particularly thinking about maintaining that myth and this way that you talk about the hiding the interdependent nature of human life. And also for those who can afford it, paying for care maybe helps maintain the myth of independence and maybe gives a sense of autonomy, but only for some. For others, the low paid, the less powerful Black, migrant, working class women, they bear the brunt of this myth. But I've been recently wondering, even with money, the fact that you need another person to get you out of bed, to feed you, to wash you, to dress you, means that you're not independent in terms of self-sufficiency. So really the extent to which money removes the burden on others because you're paying someone to do it. So immediately that starts me thinking around, well, that relates to how we think about care as well as how we think about independence. So thinking about care as a burden and needing care as a burden only makes sense if we are wedded to the myth of independence. If we understand needing care as part of being a human and personhood as interdependent, we can see that no one is truly independent. And once we start thinking about that, we can think about it, and of course, in lots of other spheres, the different ways that we're all dependent on others, other people, jobs, the environment to maintain life. And in cultures where this understanding of interdependence is the dominant one, the idea of needing care in old age, it's not a burden, and in some cultures, reaching old age is celebrated and associated with wisdom, and taking care of elders is an honour. But in the US, as in the UK and in many other places, independence is often about financial independence. And, is this really what we're talking about, this dominant dimension of independence? And you talked about this in your book, about the material security it can provide, with many examples. And I'm taking just one when you talked about Mrs. Cole, and for her being financially independent allowed her to define the terms of her relationship with her care worker. So this is perhaps more than about the amount of money that you have, but the importance of that you have enough money to put you on equal terms. So the power of money not to be messed with was how I was thinking about it. And you noted that Mrs. Cole narrates her life as the classic American dream. She's achieved prosperity and self-reliance despite the structural barriers of racism, class and gender. and how the prosperity and independence she had struggled hard for all of her life had to be protected, and how it was constantly and even aggressively and violently attacked, maybe because it always remained precarious, and how now through her aging and needing home care, this becomes even more difficult. So she manages this by treating her care workers as domestic servants and minimizing her dependence on them, and as you say, obscuring the ways in which her life has changed and become diminished. But she needs to do an awful lot of work to maintain the myth of independence. And as you say, you explain that in a racist and sexist world, Black women like Mrs. Cole can only be treated as full persons if they achieve material wealth and the power and status that this brings. And I thought a lot about that, and maybe that is the case in the States, but I do wonder about this. In the UK, for example, material wealth doesn't seem to protect Black people from suspicion and racism, and we've had recently quite a lot of very public examples. There's been quite a focus on racism, institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police or the London Police Force. So we've had a lot of public examples of Black members of Parliament, elite athletes, lawyers getting stopped on the street and searched, and possibly even more so because assumptions about Black people having wealth equates to some form of criminality, usually drug dealing. So I'm less sure about the extent to which financial power mitigates against racism or ageism or homophobia or transphobia or sexism and so on. And that's partly because I'm currently involved in some very interesting discussions about this kind of thing in work that's about LGBT aging and the extent to which class and money enable certain navigation through homophobia, for example. You give us other examples of older people buying home care rather than relying on their family to take care of them as another way of sustaining independence and autonomy. It allows older people to see themselves as equal participants in market exchanges rather than dependent on family members to keep their standing equitable within their relationships. And that was something that also has chimed a lot in some of the research that I've done. So we can see immediately that independence is a core American value necessary for autonomy and citizenship, and it is so closely tied to personhood, the right to be a human in the modern sense of the word, the right to be treated as an individual with legal, civil and political rights and rights over your individual self. And that's what I think makes it so powerful and useful for those struggling to free themselves of oppressive power of others. So the struggles for independence, historic ones and current ones, from imperialism to become independent nations, so political struggles. And all of these are very important and significant, the more we might think of positive meanings of independence. But I think we also have to think about what I would term the misuses of the notion of independence for political purposes, which we have seen a lot of in UK welfare policies over the last 30 years or so, where the word independence has become this sort of key signifier of a lot of different things. But basically, it's about shifting responsibilities for care, which could be organised and have been historically in the British welfare state, organised in a way, in a shared way, and shifting that far, much further onto individuals, but also fueling this myth of self-sufficiency and putting it to political purposes. And I think that to me there's something about power that is going on there that's about evading taking responsibility for people for whom the idea of independence as self-sufficiency is not an option and maybe never will be. And in all of this, as in the US, and you've talked about the crisis in care and care workers, same story here, really. It's care work and care workers who become the sort of collateral damage from the work needed to hide the impossibility of independence. And as you said, in the United States, independence is often generated by obscuring the myriad ways that poorly paid women like home care workers contribute to the lives of others. And I found that, really resonated. So in the UK, this concept of independence, it has been really weaponised, I'd say, as part of a welfare reform and a privatisation of publicly funded services. It's aligned, or it did align very much with this idea of an underclass discourse that previously we had this over-generous state provision of support, which was actually harmful for people because it made them dependent. So removing state support is to make people independent and free from this paternalistic state. And in that process, in the English social care system, the word independence became really linked to this idea of choice, which is another concept we could talk a lot about. Being able to choose which services meet your needs. And the argument goes that state provision doesn't allow this. So like the idea of independence, it's really difficult to argue against the idea of choice, particularly when some of those arguments have been fought very hard for by disability activists, for example, who've been struggling for independent living within the context of the British welfare state. However, it does, no surprises here, completely fit with the privatisation of public services, the clawing back of the welfare state, and choice, paradoxically, is now compulsory. You can't choose not to choose. And the supposed independence, that choice through the market is supposed to guarantee, is completely an illusion. So that's a very instrumental version of independence. And it doesn't really allow you to do what you have done, which is explore what independence means in old age to individual older people who need care. And when you talk about this moral imagination, I think that's really important, of having this broader understanding. And it was clear in the people that you spoke to that this involved a relational understanding, and that's intricately connected to relationships of care. So being able to live in ways which reflect subjective experiences and identity, the idea of continuity with yourself. And that is much more than sustaining bare life. And it certainly goes a long way beyond a checklist of tasks on a care plan. And how you describe this in your work, of how older people sought to reciprocate their care workers, to show care and concern for them in various ways. This really resonated with me in research that I did a few years ago about older people's experiences of well-being and the importance of still being able to contribute something, to give back to carers, and this idea that it equalises the situation, but it also helps offset some of these really negative feelings of burden and care as a burden that we've been bombarded with, as well as helping to maintain this continuity of self and feelings of worth that dependency challenges. But this really, in the study that I did, went far beyond the idea of payment, and it couldn't really be captured in sort of financial terms or transactions around paying for care. So what you've done is that you've showed us that paid home care in the States generates independent persons by capitalising on inequality, and how this brings together old people and poor people through this work that is supposed to sustain both. And when you talk about this, you've talked also about this idea of it requires the erasure of generative labour, the sort of mundane labour of making life, what some have called the work that enables all work. And thinking about erasure as well also made me think about people like Mrs. Cole and the work that's required of different kinds that is needed to maintain this myth of independence by individual older people like your participants, developing all kinds of personal strategies to maintain the myth, but also by those in power. So the policymakers that I've referred to, the decision makers, governments, it kind of goes on. And it left me with many thoughts, really, thinking about, you know, who is served well by independence? And can we shift this stranglehold it seems to hold over us, actually through doing what you've done, through a sort of deeper engagement with care? And that's where I stopped, because I thought that was probably more than enough. But it's a great book, thank you.
Am I unmuted now? Okay, my Zoom is acting up again like last time, which is actually making it very difficult for me to see if anyone has a question. So if you have a question, why don't you just use the raise hand function? Although I actually can only see like 6 screens now of participants. Anyway, Elana, can you see everyone? Or?
I think so.
Okay, so maybe you can handle questions, but I was going to invite you first to if you want to comment on if you want to reply in any way to, and then sorry if you could just call on people, that would be easier.
Sure,
I don't know
no problem.
what is happening. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. Thank you so much for those comments. It's always so wonderful to hear what people pick up in the book and what kinds of connections. And it's really, really helpful for me to hear your read of this material from a different point, from the British point of view, and thinking about how these similar kinds of, in a different historical context, similar kinds of signs have been taken up. And I think indeed, certainly the sort of neoliberal privatizing move has weaponized independence in a way that's illuminating, to say the least, of some of the dynamics. As you were talking, I was thinking about the ways in which, independence as a sort of sign or symbol of personhood, the kinds of affordances it offers, in the sense of how many different ways it can get read and how many different meanings, you sort of outline those so beautifully. And it has me returning to this question that I and some of my colleagues kind of go round and round about, which is that indeed, under the sign of independence, women, or at least some women, have sought liberation from patriarchy under the sign of independence, although that's not always the language. I think under the sign of freedom, which maybe is a little different from independence, that enslaved people sought emancipation, and that it is worrisome to try and go, most of the models of interdependence that we're familiar with are ones in which inequality is recognized, but also enforced and separated and hardened. And so one of the questions I go round and round about is how to think about ways of being, ways of recognizing persons, ways of organizing social life that don't hide interdependence and also don't capture people within, rigid hierarchies that, although more maybe honest about the structures that make personhood possible, or the structures that, they make those inequalities visible and celebrate them even. That doesn't, as someone raised in a liberal society, I don't find that attractive. But how do we think about interdependence and how to organize interdependence, and the ways in which it may be, can we do this without hierarchy? How would we imagine interdependence in a way that, even better maybe captures the aspirations of liberation, people moving towards liberation? Is that even possible? I know that's a question I end up with all the time. Like, can we move towards the aspirations of a sort of liberatory ethic that's underneath the feminist movements and the emancipation movements, whether they're the post-colonial ones or the the anti-slavery ones, but without reproducing the kinds of hierarchies that independence is demanding, and the kinds of invisibility, which indeed, are sort of, they reproduce racial engendered structures. You just can't see them anymore. They're still there. And they enable some women and some people of color to occupy the position of the independent person, but not many. And as I thought your kind of critique, I think it was Mrs. Cole who sort of said, money will buy me out of race. That as a Black woman, if I'm wealthy enough, I might be able to, inhabit this other position. And indeed, as your research shows, like that's a precarious or limited kind of gambit, that independence isn't really like what she's looking for, the liberation she's looking for isn't really possible even with money. Which the other thing I kept thinking about is the way in which indeed like money is imagined as cutting networks, as making it possible to buy yourself out of being a burden, or and the way that independence and money are kind of co-constituted, as like that money makes a person, in this sense, a liberal person. And of course, yeah, I think Mrs. Cole is an example of the, both the hope for that, although she's a publicly funded, her services are governmentally, are like 95% of the money that is funding her home care is public money. But yeah, the symbolic value of her contribution for her as liberating is interesting in and of itself. I think I'll stop there, but yeah, I think, and I am intrigued by, I think, some of the current organizing across a variety of both the, at least in the United States, the current anti-racist movements and the current movements, like domestic workers movements, that they seem to be, maybe they're beginning to articulate or to try to formulate articulations of interdependence that are also liberatory. And I'm intrigued by those as places where people are working on these contradictions and these problems, that how do we, nobody wants to leave aside the aims of liberation that ideas of independence hold, and at the same time, the need to recognize interdependence in order to maybe produce that. I don't know, it's something I'm watching kind of with fascination and hope, I guess. I don't know. I'll leave it there because there's hands open.
Thank you. So I think we should go to questions. And if you want to call on people, I don't know if people have their hands up or if they want to do the raise hand function, or if people are putting in chat,
Sure.
do it that way.
I see a hand. Cool. I think I'm not saying your name correctly. Could you correct me?
Yes. Hi. Yeah,
Hi.
that's correct. Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was such a great presentation today, and also my PhD research on elderly women in Thailand, and I found your book to be very interesting, and it is very valuable for my research. So I think my point is more like sharing about the findings from the research I'm conducting. So I interviewed some of the women in their 60s in Thailand, and I thought your concepts about independence and power actually are quite very relevant to research, because so first of all, as a context in Thailand, it's very different from the US, because people are still living in their families, and people are living in like extended families. So sometimes care responsibilities are delegated amongst the family members. So if you have an older family member, then people would take turns in taking care of that elderly person. And also there is this cultural belief that if you take care of your elderly parents or like elderly family members, it's a form of gratitude that you're giving back to that family member. So yeah, we're living arrangement is more to do with interdependence rather than either dependence or independence. So yeah, that's a very interesting pattern I found. And also a lot of the interviewees stated that they wanted to be self-reliant and not being dependent on their children, on their adult children. And then they specifically said, look, I don't want to be a burden to my family. So I think that's very relevant to your book as well, on the concept of independence. But I think in the Thai context is a little bit different, because when people are talking about independence, it's more to do with the family. It's more to do with their feelings towards their families and not wanting their children to carry on the burden of taking care of them. So yeah, that's really what I wanted to share, because yeah, it's really good to know about the different cultural contexts when it comes to care. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that comment. It's really interesting to hear you talk about that, in part because I wonder, I mean, there's not necessarily a great way to answer this question, but I wonder how the discourses about intergenerational gratitude intersect with these questions about being a burden, right? So if older, like, it sounds like younger people repay older generations care. It's care as a form of gratitude towards older generations who then don't want that because it's a burden. Is an interesting, I wonder how that's played out over time. And you might find a colleague of mine in anthropology has a book called Rituals of Care that's actually in some ways one of the most, it's a really interesting challenge to sort of dominant Euro-American conceptions about what care is. In that the author's name is Felicity Aulino, and the research is based in Chiang Mai in Thailand. And she argues that Buddhist understandings of care, or at least in Chiang Mai, are really quite different from the understandings that I describe, and that are dominant at least in the United States. And she really focuses on care as bodily embodied practice, and as the ethical underpinnings of that care as ritual. So I would be fascinated to sort of hear what you thought about, what she found intersects with what you're finding in your work. Because I think one of the things that is challenging as we talk about care is that we're both talking about an ideology that has a very particular cultural trajectory, that it's located in particular moral imaginations that have a rootedness in particular histories, local and regional histories. And we're talking about a set of practices that are necessary to sustain life. Usually, at least in English discourse, those two meanings of the word happen together. But when we start looking cross-culturally, my question is actually if that's a problem. If our understandings of what care is as a sort of moral practice don't travel very well comparatively, for example, to Thailand. And that's part of Aulino's argument. Even though the practices look very similar, like we're talking about very similar kinds of washing bodies, feeding people, taking care of homes, but the moral imaginings that shape them are culturally located and have different kinds of histories. And that because in the United States, or at least in English, we use the same word for both things, we have a hard time seeing the differences and asking questions about what kinds of different moral imaginings about personhood, about community, about family, about obligation, about reciprocity are being conveyed in the word care as we talk about these concrete practices. Anyway, that's a little like how anthropologists get involved in these questions. But so thank you so much for sharing that. It's really interesting. I look forward to reading more. Please send it my way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you again for sharing your book as well.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I see Asha.
Hi. Thanks so much for that talk. And I really, really enjoyed reading the introduction, and I can't wait to read the rest of the book. Of course, we've enjoyed being able to have some more extended conversations now this year, prompted in part through this forum, Daniel. So
thanks.
We appreciate it. So, and I think it's really interesting to bring anthropology into conversation with philosophy. And so I want to kind of urge you to perhaps think philosophically with a particular question, and then on the broader methodological point, I think that so I'll raise that specific question in a second, but on the broader methodological point, I think the description of practices is essential to ethical evaluation of them. So, I prefer Rawls's old way of thinking about justice as fairness, from his 1958 paper as an assessment of the system of practices. And I think that's kind of altogether compatible with the kind of project you're engaged in. So that's just sort of a plug for saying that the anthropological endeavor of describing practices is, I think, actually quite essential to the philosophical endeavor of evaluating justice or ethics. And I think Margaret Urban Walker's book, Moral Understandings, is also one that's quite compatible with that approach in terms of asking for a kind of transparency testing. She calls for kind of transparency testing for which we need to understand what the practices are. So I see your work as really essential to that endeavor, and qualitative work in care ethics is really essential to that endeavor. And, my own Arrow of Care map also calls for that kind of tracking. But so the specific question that I have for you is about, well, I was so intrigued by your discussion kind of toward the end of the introduction about the loss of boundaries between, the care workers and their clients, and the way that often ended up resulting in them losing their jobs. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think about that? What is the way to understand these boundaries? Is it, because I can see that there's a risk of exploitation if the boundaries are lost, but I think you also highlight some of the harms that result from people, the institutions failing to recognize that there's going to be some permeability. So here I'm pushing you. This is the question where I'm pushing you, think philosophically.
I mean, I think that the problem here is that if the whole system is committed to understanding persons as separate, then the boundaries are both necessary and damaging, and they can't not exist. Like trying to think about how to, if we begin as separate persons, and that's the assumption, then the flows that make those persons possible are always risky. I mean, reciprocities are risky under any form. Reciprocity is always risky, at least as far as anthropologists are concerned. So the question isn't so much like, should there be boundaries, but how do we understand those boundaries as being created? And what kind of practices would we use to sustain the ones that we need? So like, these boundaries, they're impossible for people and necessary. But are there other ways of constituting boundaries that would not create that that friction? So, I mean, there's no perfect thing. I mean, for anthropologists, all reciprocities are dangerous, right? So that there's reciprocity produces obligation, and obligations are always risky. It's both things. The gift is always risky. So that the things that we share, I mean, that can't entirely be eliminated, but certainly reciprocities that are driven underground also can't be. They can't be. What am I trying to say? Like we can't have a conversation about what the sort of like the socially for an example, like when we do reciprocities that are really well understood, like Secret Santas, we all know sort of what the ways to do those are that are safe. And we kind of have a sense of how far you can go within that structure. But when you do gifts underground, they become risky in other ways. And we can't monitor them. And then their mere existence is dangerous.
So is it the lack of visibility that's risky rather than the reciprocity? I mean, it seems like the initial gift might be the initiation of the riskiness. The reciprocity, I would understand reciprocity as the response to it. Does that necessarily give rise to additional risk? I would think maybe, but maybe not. But really, in these cases, maybe the solution is for there to be more transparency in the social practices about like which kinds of gifts are appreciated and which are, in the context of these social inequalities, which are not welcome, like which gifts are insulting, I
mean, I think that would help. I mean, I guess I think the thing is that when I'm thinking about like reciprocities or exchange broadly, like how are we constituting relations through exchanges, and how does independence imagine what sort of independence as a sort of imagine certain kinds of exchanges as dangerous and certain ones as not. So it is dangerous for an older adult who may or may not have a full sense of the obligations entailed to be loaning a ton of money. You know, like, is that older adult being taken advantage of, or are they doing something? And that's the case in the book, that one of the cases in the book is an older adult is ended up loaning an enormous amount of money to a care worker who ended up getting fired. It's a really, you know, it's an upsetting case for a lot of reasons. And transparency would help. But if we only see the relationships between those two people as what's at stake, we miss the fact that the worker needed that money in order to pay for her gas to get to her job. So that, like, the reciprocities aren't only between these two people, even though our ideas about independence suggest that that's where the problem is. In fact, it's this whole web of social and interpersonal relations that's making that problem. So the boundaries between these people are also about how we're structuring the whole social scene. So if she can't afford gas to get to her job and is taking like loans to be able to make rent and pay for gas and things like that, and then gets fired for it, it's not just that reciprocity that's dangerous, right? It's just that set of exchanges. And the boundaries between those two people are putting her, like, the ways in which we're constructing the relationship is between those two people only, who are independent from each other and not as embedded in these broader systems of relations, like these broader inequalities. We can't extract them. Like these loans that get her fired aren't separate from all the other parts. So the boundaries aren't just between the two of them, but the way that, like, her needing that money is seen as her problem. So transparency helps, but in this case, the problem doesn't go away until she can pay for gas to get to her job and rent and all that. Like,
yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I don't want to kind of take too much time, but as kind of one more follow-up, I mean, I wonder, I think Lizzie Ward, your comments were also so interesting. And, you know, I think the positive value of independence, I mean, I'm convinced that it does still have, you know, some positive value, in part because in that, say, in these interactions, some of the interactions you're describing in the book, respect for the other as a decision maker of their own, I think, is a crucial part of, you know, what you're describing as the making of personhood, right? It's a kind of respect for the person as someone who can make their own decisions. And so, right, so there's the interdependence as a kind of descriptive matter about the overall state of affairs. But then I almost want to kind of go in the direction of Chris Korsgaard here to say that, you know, treating the other as an end in themselves, as a decision maker, is kind of a vital part of living in a community of autonomous people. So I mean, I guess I would just want to, I guess that's a you know, a few cheers for independence.
I mean, I guess the question I keep having is that, I mean, respect for the other, respect for the person seems, I mean, that in and of itself, yes, but that the way in which, at least in this case, that actually, I mean, respect for the person out and to make their own decisions, except that they're embedded in decisions which constantly implicate each other and all of us. And so they're like, those decisions, they're not just constrained, but that we're all in a web together. How do we have both respect, right, for the value of the person in themselves, and recognize that we're all in a web together, so that what one of us does that isn't separate. I mean, it's not it just is. So those things I think are really hard to untangle. Like I'm certainly not ready to say, oh yes, so since we're all on a web together, some people shouldn't have respect or shouldn't make decisions, but that we aren't ever making our decisions that feel autonomous are always implicated in these webs. Other people are in them. And in care, that we're always making decisions that implicate other people. I don't know how to untangle those. I mean, I think that's the question. I don't have, as a social, like as an empiricist, I don't necessarily have the question. I'm really intrigued by the way that people try to untangle that. And as like a person, I want that untangled too.
Well, thanks for indulging the foray into philosophical thinking. I'm certainly glad that the questions can't be posed to philosophers otherwise to quickly do a bunch of empirical research and return. Well, we'll talk a lot more.
We'll talk more, yeah. Kelly, I got that right? Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. It's so it's wonderful to be here. I'm another philosopher. Hi, everyone. And I have a question about, or I wanted to sort of like ask you about your understanding of embodied empathy and like sort of how it seems like you're taking it. I only read the introduction as well, and just I'm really excited about your work. And I also work on like a main concept that I'm trying to articulate is about the contradictions of care and like under conditions of structural violence. I'm also sort of like have been heavily into social reproduction feminism and like the real kind of ways in which intersectional violence embedded in caring relations is like structural to capitalism, etc. So, but I'm really excited about going into that. That's chapter 5, I think you said, about the
4 and 5, yeah,
embodied empathy part, because I'm trying to work through some ideas in care ethics, because care ethics in particular really wants to like look at the moral good of things like caring attention and empathy, etc. And so what I'm trying to do is like look at the ways in which these forms of violence are like precisely embedded all the way down in these kinds of intimate encounters, and if like Black feminists have articulated, bell hooks like eating the other, and these sorts of things that are just like so endemic in like something like empathy in particular. But I'm just, I just really love to hear some more thoughts on that. Just like the embodied kind of dimensions of how you understand those kinds of ambiguities that empathy, something like empathy holds. Or if I'm understanding you correctly, I might be projecting my own stuff onto your work too.
No, I mean, that's very much the lines along which that chapter moves, which is to say that people, so I think about series of embodiment in anthropology in which make a sort of strong move to think about thought and action, or mind and body, as inseparable, right? So to move into that, so thinking about the body as the sort of the experiential ground of and so that, I mean, that chapter is really mostly about the ways in which workers take on care, so that not just the like labor of it, but the part where sustaining continuity of subjectivity, so people's abilities to live the way they want to, is really a consistent marker of good care. And both workers and older adults articulate that really clearly in a way that was actually surprising to me. And it made me a little suspicious. Like when you hear people say the same thing, it's either really indicative of a deep cultural, shared cultural sense of things, or people are just repeating what they think they're supposed to say. And in this case, it maybe is a little both. the sense that good care would make people feel like the person they had been. So both independent and sort of this continuous thing. And the continuous thing I also think is a hallmark of Euro-American ideas of the self and the person, that change is somehow problematic to being a person. That's not so much the independence part, but like another piece of personhood. And so, you know, workers are, in a very matter of fact, this isn't like a very, they don't really talk, they talk about it when I ask, but it's a very matter of fact thing of like, well, you know, the client is diabetic, but she only likes to eat her cereal with, you know, heaping spoonfuls of sugar. I'm not gonna, you know, my supervisor wants me to stop serving that at all. I'm not gonna do that. What I'm gonna do is empty out the sugar bowl and replace it with Splenda, and she won't be able to tell, and it'll still work, and like, it's close enough. There was a lot of this like calibrating. And when we think, or I think the scene I talk about at the beginning of the book is the scene about the back, this sort of calibration between what sensorial experience will make someone really feel like themselves and also be, you know, adjust to the bodily specificities of the moment. And so to think about what, I mean, this is like the most mundane thing we do at CARE at all points in the life course, is sort of think like, well, what does this body, this person body need, and how can I perform it? But we have to use our bodies to do that. And so, and that, I mean, it's an act of empathy. I mean, some of the anthropological colleagues I have would say that all empathy is embodied, and that even in saying that, it's like a redundant phrase, which I'm fine with. I was really trying to, for audiences that don't do that work, really trying to draw out the physicality of this kind of imagination, that it is imagination, and it is deeply physical, it is deeply sensorial. But that also means that people who do the work assume that they will be sensorially uncomfortable, that they are inhabiting someone else's being, and in inhabiting someone else's being, or in inhabiting the, you know, that they will not enjoy it, that their enjoyment of it is besides the point, their comfort is besides the point. And so I have a whole range of cases that I talk about that. Workers who worked in the homes of people who were described as hoarders that, you know, they thought were truly disgusting. Workers who didn't go to the bathroom for like 8 hours at a time because they didn't want to go. I mean, that same worker didn't want to go to the bathroom in the home. To like much more mundane, like the household is kept too hot. I'm uncomfortable. You know, a whole variety of those things. And so that's like the one piece of it, is that this is, and I don't know, you know, I'm interested in thinking about, you know, in other contexts, is this producing the subjectivity of another also, and then, you know, also intrinsic to care? Is that actually part of your American understanding of personhood? To me, that's an ethnographic and comparative question. I don't know. I would suspect not. And then the second piece is that placing that within these broader structures, and then asking, right, so that it's not, to say it's not coincidental that this labor that requires subsuming yourself into the other, and that those, you know, that you cannot be of the other, that you have to be separate and then subsume. It's not then coincidental that the hierarchies in care are the hierarchies of our broader social world, right? That's actually how it works, right? Like, because of the broader hierarchies, it is possible for those subsumations to be acceptable. And that's what it looks like to me, right? That and that in doing the work, right, that talk about like the wages of care, something like the wages, the non-monetary wages of work. In doing the work, the women who do it find a kind of moral value in putting other people first. Not that it justifies it, or, you know, I mean, like the women were deeply critical of the broader structures of it, and said that what they did still mattered, that producing people in this way, like sustaining people, that still mattered, and in fact had a kind of sort of alternate arguments about the good in care, right? That suggested that they had a different, you know, or sort of that their work was morally valuable and made them valuable beyond the hierarchies in which they were positioned, and also that it was, nonsense that they couldn't sustain their lives while doing it. And they sort of said both things. I'm not sure if that actually answered your question, but I'm thinking, it's really concrete to me. This isn't, and people would talk, they could talk about it. It wasn't, observing it made it make sense in a different way, but care workers that I knew used this kind of language too. Particularly about the why they were doing what they were doing and why it mattered.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, I look forward to checking out your work.
Elana, can you put me at, I don't know who's up next, but can you put me at the bottom of the list? I have a question when you get to me.
I don't see any hands, so you should go.
Oh, really? Oh, good.
Am I right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because this actually follows up on what you were just saying. So I really like this holistic approach you have to these problems and the interconnections and the interdependency and paying attention to, as you were describing earlier, things about how the problems that are created in care, some of the tensions that happen between the person, the caregiver, or the elderly person. These are generated precisely because there are already these inequalities of society, and so that you have to, if you're going to really take on elder care, you also have to take on poverty, and you have to take on wages and all these kinds of things. So I love that analysis, and you have to think about the care workers, that they have people that they're caring for also, and so you need to think about these things. So I really like this analysis, but then it becomes a little so I'm in a public policy school, and it becomes a little overwhelming to think about how you unwind all this. And as you just said, right, the hierarchies of care, these are just reflecting the hierarchies that exist in the broader society. And so really to achieve the level of care and type of care you would want, you have to address these broader hierarchies that are just becoming, that in one way or another find their way into care. And even then, it seems like, if you start okay, well, let's just pay these workers better. Instead of, some of the statistics you cite are just, really heartbreaking. That company, they started them at $7.50 an hour, and they get a 5-cent raise a year for 26 years, up to a max of $9 or something. That's just crazy. But okay, let's start with that. We will pay all care workers a good wage and make sure they have health care, something like this, right? Take on some of these things. But then it seems like all this stuff's just going to get somehow, all these problems are just going to re-arise. They're just going to take a different form unless we're dealing with all these other things. So what do you say? Where do we go, or how do we take all this on?
I think that the raft of policy interventions are pretty clear, right? And they and in and of themselves don't inherently, they do a lot of things to reshape the structure of the work in ways that matter. So and we'll see, some of this stuff is actually being debated in legislation right now. The big expansion, is it the Build Back Better bill, the big infrastructure investment? These are the questions at the heart of some of those debates. And I think one of the things is that as we start talking about policy, now I think about legislation that's been enormously important legislation, both for older adults and for people in general who have disabilities, right? That the ADA. And that if we make claims on one another or to the state, using the language of independence, right? Rather than some other language of liberation, we actually are going to end up reproducing these sort of zero-sum ways of talking about policy. So that this is what's going on in the legislation right now. They're debating whether, should worker supports get cut or should expansions to Medicaid get cut? It apparently can't be both. And so I think part of it is actually starting to, when I think about this at a policy level, I think about, when we structure policy evaluations and we look at outcomes, do we talk about, are the program evaluations looking at outcomes only for older adults, since Medicaid cares for older adults, or are they looking at outcomes for workers? Are worker outcomes part of the outcome of policy? Right, because that's where this kind of cultural sense of independence that workers and older adults are separate gets into the policy, is that Medicaid can then be a healthcare program when it turns out it's one of the biggest jobs programs in the country. And we don't evaluate it as one. Like its successes or failures really so that we can talk about like welfare leavers as, under jobs policy, but not notice that they're actually going into things like Medicaid paid jobs, jobs that are funded by Medicaid. We can't see the connections, we can't evaluate them. So at a policy level, I start thinking about, can we structure program evaluations and policy evaluations to recognize that, all policies also employ people and that the kinds of jobs that they create are meaningful. If they create bad jobs, they will have certain kinds of persistent problems, like turnover. And maybe that matters and maybe it doesn't, or maybe it matters to who, but those are policy questions. And I think, especially, I think a lot about Medicaid and how Medicaid is evaluated. What happens if we evaluate it as both things? Healthcare is work, right? Care and the way in which we structure the program, the evaluations of the program, the intended outcomes of the program, can't see that. And that travels up. That travels in both ways. When we make the policy, we can we really decide? We actually can't, right? We can't actually decide to grow home care jobs unless we make them better jobs. There are literally no people to do these jobs right now. So the idea that we would even imagine that we could cut, that we can fund more home care, we could expand home care, we could get people off the waiting list without actually making them better jobs. There are no more people willing to do this work. And in this particular moment, that's especially true, but it has been true at least as long as I've been looking at the data. The data, right, they have always shown that both turnover and shortage are high under these conditions, can't really get people to do the work. So that's the kind of thing I start thinking about, is like they're really concrete. Like, what does this look like when we move it up? When we think about the ADA, do we talk about independence, or do we talk about, people flourishing, both people, all the people involved in these relationships flourishing? And how would we, this isn't how policy evaluation usually works, because it's so deeply based in econometric, and like economic analysis that assumes itself individuals that are separate from one another. So I mean,
yeah.
But some of it we could do.
Lizzie, are things any better in the UK on this kind of stuff?
No. But as you're talking, it's almost like, from the policy world, it goes to this question of what actually even counts as knowledge about care isn't the lived experience. It's about units of care, time and task, 15, care divided up into 15-minute slots. But I think you're right. I think if we had a policy environment which looked more holistically, you would maybe move towards that. At the moment, we have got, apparently, Boris Johnson has a big idea about reforming social care, so that, we've had crisis for a long time, far before the pandemic. And before the financial crash, actually, it's like nobody wants to deal with this question politically, because inevitably it means that who's going to pay? Who's going to pay? And again, it misses the point, really. It completely misses the point. But because we've just had nothing going on in terms of a proper kind of policy leadership, and we've had big cuts in sort of public care, it's kind of like the social care system has become, particularly in residential care, like it's attracted a lot of kind of hedge funding and, people that are in speculative investment that has nothing to do with care at all. It's sort of, it's a wealth extraction thing. And of course, when that has happened, it means it's like, well, for both the care workers and the people that are receiving care, this is like the worst news, because it's not about either of it. It's not about the people who need care's needs, and it's not about the care workers. So we're in a pretty bad way. If you add to that the disaster of Brexit, a lot of care work in the UK depended on European workers that have gone. The pandemic, another complete disaster in terms of how care workers were treated and not protected. And many have left because, well, firstly, because they could earn more money in supermarkets, which they did. And then they've just introduced a scheme that, and it runs out in the next week or so, that care workers must be vaccinated. A lot of them don't want to be. So we're in big trouble, really, I'm afraid to say. But I think you're right. If it really needs a completely different way of looking about what a policy is for. Yeah.
I mean, I don't, there's some like hopeful policy movement. We'll see what happens with infrastructure spending here in the US, although we'll see if it actually gets, I mean, given the history, I won't be surprised if it gets cut in a deal, given the politics. The history is that these kinds of things don't, they're the things that get sacrificed, particularly because of the groups of people who they serve. We'll see if the politics and the the demographics of the electorate shift anything. I don't think under like a highly financialized neoliberal policy thing, I don't feel a lot of compulsion to offer recommendations, because I don't feel like it doesn't feel like there's any shared project, right? Like, but I don't know, we'll see. I mean, the shortages are really intense right now. We'll see if it matters. It's hard to see how it plays out. I mean, at least in the US, the broader upheaval in the labor force is really something to behold, and how that all shakes out and whether care gets included in that or not, I don't know. I mean, these kinds of jobs have often not. We'll see.
Well, with that, I think we come to the end of our time. That was a fascinating discussion, great presentation, great commentary. Thank you both for this, and thank you all for coming. Yeah, let's give them a round of applause. I will leave this meeting and I'm going to contact Zoom. I don't know why my Zoom keeps seizing up. I think are you guys still seeing the transcription? Is that still working, or did that stop working? Oh, that's still working. Okay.
Okay.
Because my transcription seizes up, and then my whole Zoom screen seizes up. And anyway, I'll contact and hope to have that fixed by November 19th, when Maurice Hamilton here will present. Maurice, you want to say a word about your book and who's going to be here?
Yeah, we're going to have a group of the authors that contributed to the new University of Minnesota Press book, Caring in the Age of Precarity, Care Ethics in the Age of Precarity. And the book is actually coming out next month. And so for those who attend, we will also have a discount certificate from the University of Minnesota Press. So I can't show you the book because it's coming out next month, and we'll talk about it then. Okay, good. All right, so I'll send you all reminders about that. But until next month, be safe and be well. And thank you all for being here again today. And have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much for your comments and questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Ward.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye.
Okay, bye.